May 17th, 1945, 14:23 hours. A detention facility near Lüneburg, northern Germany. Rain hammers the corrugated roof. Greta Müller stands in the processing line, her Wehrmachthelferin uniform soaked through, watching the British sergeant at the intake desk. He's writing something in a ledger with careful precision. When her turn comes, he looks up. "Name?" he asks through an interpreter. She gives it, expects a slap, a shove, rough hands. Instead, he slides a tin cup across the table. Steam rises from it. "Tea," he says in broken German. "You'll want to sit. Processing takes time." The cup is warm in her hands. She doesn't understand. She doesn't understand anything anymore. If you're interested in the untold stories of how humanity survived the darkest chapter of the 20th century, hit that subscribe button now. These accounts challenge everything we think we know about enemies, allies, and what happens when propaganda collides with reality. They had been told many things: that the British were weak, soft, decadent, that their empire was crumbling, their soldiers cowards who ran at Dunkirk, that if captured, German women would face unspeakable brutality, the kind reserved for enemies who dared serve the Reich in any capacity. By 1945, over 500,000 German women had served as Wehrmacht auxiliaries, telephone operators, clerks, meteorologists, anti-aircraft spotters. They weren't soldiers in name, but they wore uniforms. They served the war machine. And when Germany collapsed, thousands found themselves in British custody. They expected punishment. They expected vengeance. What they got was something far more confusing. The first crack came within hours. Greta finished her tea, real tea, not the ersatz bark and chicory they'd been drinking for 2 years, and was led to a makeshift medical station. A British Army nurse waited there, clipboard in hand, stethoscope around her neck. The nurse gestured to a chair. Greta sat. The examination was thorough, but gentle. Temperature taken, throat checked, eyes examined for signs of disease. The nurse made notes, asked questions through the interpreter about existing conditions, allergies, injuries. At one point, Greta flinched when the nurse reached toward her shoulder. The nurse stopped immediately, held up both hands. "I'm checking for lois," she said softly. "That's all. I won't hurt you." The words made no sense. Why would an enemy nurse promise not to hurt you? Why would she care? But the gentleness in her voice was unmistakable. When a minor wound on Greta's arm was discovered, barbed wire 2 days prior, the nurse cleaned and dressed it with careful attention. She used antiseptic, real bandages, not rags. "You'll need to keep this clean," the nurse said. "Come back in 3 days so we can check it." 3 days, as if Greta had a future. Britain held around 400,000 German prisoners by 1946, with treatment that was strict but generally humane, and fewer prisoners died in British captivity than in other Allied nations. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear protocols. Prisoners were to be housed adequately, fed sufficiently, and protected from violence. The British government introduced a re-education program intended to demonstrate the evils of the Nazi regime while promoting the advantages of democracy. But beyond legal requirements, there was something else, a cultural commitment to order, to standards, to the idea that how you treat your enemies defines who you are. The women auxiliaries presented a unique challenge. They weren't frontline combatants, yet they'd served the Wehrmacht. Security screenings were conducted to identify those with connections to war crimes or hardcore Nazi ideology. The rest were processed as displaced persons or auxiliary personnel, technically not POWs under strict definition, but under Allied control nonetheless. Mortality rates were kept remarkably low. Inspections were regular. The Red Cross monitored conditions. The message was clear: we will not become what we defeated. Processing took 2 days. The women were divided into groups based on their roles and security classifications. Greta's group, communications personnel with no identified war crimes connections, was assigned to a former Wehrmacht barracks that had been converted into Allied holding facilities. The barracks were sparse but clean. Metal beds with thin mattresses, wool blankets folded at the foot of each bed, a small trunk for personal belongings. Greta sat on her assigned bed and ran her hand across the blanket. It was thick, warm, whole. For the first year of 1945, she'd slept under coats and torn curtains as the Eastern Front collapsed. A British corporal appeared at the door with an armful of folded clothes. "One dress each," he announced through the interpreter. "Grey standard issue. Your uniforms will be stowed." The dresses were simple, shapeless, but they were clean and intact, free of blood or mud or the smell of defeat. That night, after lights out, Greta heard crying from several beds. Not loud sobbing, just quiet, exhausted tears. The tears of women who'd been braced for horror and instead received indifference at worst, basic decency at best. The confusion was its own kind of torture. Mornings began at 6:30 with a bell. The women arose, made their beds, and lined up for breakfast in a communal mess area. Porridge with a spoonful of jam, bread, real bread made from wheat, tea or powdered milk. It wasn't luxury, but it was consistent. After breakfast, work assignments were posted. German POWs worked in various capacities, largely agricultural or industrial, and were paid according to their status and work. The women were assigned to laundry details, kitchen assistants, or administrative tasks. Greta was sent to help in the camp administrative office, sorting papers, filing documents, translating when needed. Her supervisor was a bespectacled British lieutenant named Harge Reeves, who spoke to her the way one might address a clerk anywhere. These files need organizing by date, alphabetical after that. No shouting, no contempt, just instructions. One afternoon, Greta made an error, misfiled an entire folder. She froze when she realized, waiting for the rebuke. Harge sighed, pulled the folder out, and handed it back to her. "Try again," he said. "It happens to everyone." That was all. She stood there holding the folder, stunned by the absence of punishment. The turning point came in late June. A group of British soldiers was rotating out, heading home after months of occupation duty. The women watched from behind the wire as trucks were loaded, men laughing and joking, cigarettes passed around. One soldier noticed the women watching. He waved, just a casual wave, nothing mocking, nothing cruel. Several women instinctively waved back before catching themselves. Enemies don't wave at each other. But these men didn't look like enemies. They looked like boys eager to go home. That evening, one of the British Guards, a tall Yorkshireman named Private Davies, was stationed near the women's barracks. He was smoking, leaning against the fence, looking bored. Greta approached the wire. "Excuse me," she said in halting English. Davies looked up. "Yeah? Why are you kind?" She struggled for the word to use. Davies took a drag, exhaled slowly. "Why wouldn't we be? We are enemy." He shrugged. "War's over, innit? You're just people now." Just people. She'd been called many things: auxiliary, asset, cog in the machine, but not just people in a very long time. Davies flicked his cigarette and walked on. Greta stood at the fence for a long time after he left. By August, restrictions had loosened considerably. Women with clean security records and demonstrated cooperation were allowed to work outside the detention facilities, primarily on farms suffering from severe labor shortages. Greta was assigned to a dairy farm in Hampshire run by an older couple, the Wainwrights. She was escorted there by a British corporal who deposited her at the farmhouse door and left. No chains, no guards standing watch. Mrs. Wainwright, a woman in her 60s with calloused hands and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked Greta up and down. "You know how to milk a cow?" "No, ma'am." "You'll learn. Come on." The work was hard.
6 cows twice daily, plus milking stools, hauling feed, cleaning equipment. But at midday, Mrs. Wainwright called her into the kitchen. Lunch was laid out on the table. Cheese sandwiches, pickles, a pot of strong tea. "Sit," Mrs. Wainwright said. Greta hesitated. "Sit," the woman repeated more firmly this time. Greta sat. They ate in near silence. The only sound, the ticking of a clock and the rustle of waxed paper. Mr. Wainwright finally spoke. "Lost our son at Arnhem," he said. "Paratrooper." Greta's breath caught. She stared at her plate. I'm sorry." Mr. Wainwright nodded slowly. "Wasn't your fault. Wasn't ours either. Just the bloody war." He bit into his sandwich and said nothing more. That night, lying on her cot at the facility, Greta couldn't reconcile it. A British couple who'd lost their son to the war had fed her, taught her, treated her like a worker, not a prisoner. She tried to summon hatred for them. Couldn't find it. Tried to summon pride in the Reich. Found only ash. In September, the women gathered in the rec hall for what was called a re-education film. They filed in reluctantly, expecting propaganda. What they saw was footage from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau. Skeletal bodies piled like cordwood. Living skeletons with hollow eyes. Gas chambers, crematoria. Some women turned away, others wept. A few sat stone-faced, refusing to believe. Greta watched in silence, her hands clenched in her lap. She'd heard whispers during the war, rumors about camps in the east, but the propaganda machine had dismissed them as enemy lies, as exaggerations. This was no exaggeration. When the film ended, a British officer stood. "This is what you served," he said quietly. "Not all of you knew, but all of you enabled it." The words landed like stones. That night, the debates erupted. "That's fake," insisted Ursula, a former radio operator. "British propaganda to make us feel ashamed." "You're a fool," snapped Helga, who'd been weeping since the film. "My cousin worked near Dachau. She told me things. I didn't want to believe her." "Even if it's true," Ursula countered, "we were following orders. We had no choice." "We had a choice," Greta said quietly. "We chose not to ask questions." The room fell silent, because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? They'd all chosen comfort over curiosity, obedience over doubt, and millions had died because of those small, cowardly choices. If this story is making you think, making you uncomfortable in the right ways, subscribe now. History's hardest truths are the ones we need most. By 1947, something remarkable was happening. Once the ban on romantic relationships was lifted, 796 marriages between German POWs and British women took place immediately. These weren't between auxiliaries and British men. Regulations differed, but the phenomenon illustrated a broader shift. Former enemies were becoming neighbors, colleagues, sometimes family. Greta encountered this shift firsthand when she met Thomas, a British sergeant who worked in the administrative office where she'd been assigned. He was quiet, methodical, with ink-stained fingers and a dry human sense of humor. They didn't flirt. Regulations forbade it, and both were too cautious for that. But they talked during tea breaks, about books, about the farm Greta worked on, about Thomas's plan to become a school teacher after demobilization. One day he asked, "What will you do after?" She hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know. Go back to Germany, I suppose." "To what?" She had no answer. Her family home in Hamburg was rubble, her parents dead in the firebombing, her brother missing on the Eastern Front. Thomas looked at her carefully. "There are programs, resettlement, if you wanted to stay in Britain." "Why not?" "Why not?" Because they're enemies? Because she served the Reich? Because she couldn't finish the thought. The reasons had stopped making sense. October 1946. Greta stood in the women's washroom of the detention facility, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized herself. Her cheeks had filled out. Her skin had color again. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. She looked healthy, rested, alive. Behind her, in the mirror, she saw Helga combing her hair, Ursula washing her face. All of them transformed from the hollow-eyed ghosts who'd arrived 17 months earlier. The British had done this. The enemy had restored them to health while Germany lay in ruins. She thought of the propaganda she'd believed, the speeches about British weakness, about Aryan superiority, about the righteousness of German strength. All lies. The strongest thing the British had done was show restraint, treat enemies like humans, refuse to become monsters in order to fight monsters. That restraint had demolished her certainty. Greta turned from the mirror and walked outside. Davis was on fence duty again, smoking as usual. She approached the wire. "Private Davis?" He looked over. "Yeah? Thank you." He frowned, confused. "For what?" "For treating us like people." Davis looked embarrassed, shifted his weight. "Just doing me job, love." But it wasn't just a job. It was a choice. Every day, every interaction, every small kindness had been a choice. And those choices had changed everything. Repatriation of German POWs began in September 1946. The women auxiliaries were given the option to return to Germany or, in some cases, apply for resettlement programs if they had no family or prospects to return to. Greta chose to stay, not because she'd stopped being German, but because Germany as she'd known it, the Germany she'd believed in, no longer existed. Perhaps it never had. She settled in Hampshire, took work at the Wainwright farm permanently, eventually married a local man she'd met at church. Not Thomas. He'd moved on, pursued his teaching career elsewhere, but someone equally kind, equally ordinary. She never forgot what she'd learned in those months after the war. That propaganda is a poison that doesn't wash out easily. That your enemies might be more humane than your own leaders. That true strength isn't the willingness to destroy, but the discipline not to. Years later, in 1962, Greta's daughter asked her about the war. "Were you scared when you were captured?" She thought carefully before answering. "Yes, but not for what I expected. I was scared because they were kind, and kindness from an enemy is the most dangerous weapon of all." "Why?" "Because it makes you question everything you were taught to believe. And once you start questioning, you can never stop." She poured her daughter a cup of tea, real tea, strong and dark, and set it on the table. "Remember this. How people treat you when they don't have to tells you who they really are. Your grandfather fought against them, but when they won, they didn't gloat. They didn't take revenge. They just made tea, and that changed everything." If this story challenged something you thought you knew about war, about enemies, about what victory looks like, do me a favor and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter because they remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there were people who chose decency over cruelty, restraint over revenge, civilization over chaos. The cup of tea Greta held that first day wasn't just a drink. It was a statement,
A declaration that even in defeat, even in captivity, human dignity would be honored. Sometimes the strongest weapon is the one you choose not to.